Go live.
Yeah, I'll wait for the on air. I remember that one. Okay. John Campbell, Executive Director for the State's Attorneys and Sheriffs, and thank you for having me today. I'm a bit perplexed about this because, we all hear about simple little bills, and those are the ones that turn into be, anything but. But before I go on to testify, I just really feel like I have to say this is we have some of the hardest working individuals who are victims advocates, women and men throughout the state. They work, some of them are only one person and one victims advocate in an office. Most of them are two. To the last person, I think between them and probably DCF workers, I don't know who has got a harder job and more heart wrenching. The time that they put in, personal time they put in, I could not ask for more. I'm proud of every single person that we have working for us. I personally, prior to taking this position, as many of you know, I was in the Senate for many years, and one of the reasons I got into elected office was because of victims and because I felt that they were falling through cracks. And we worked very closely those years with the center, with Jen, and other groups to make sure the victims' rights were in fact protected. One of the things that were that I think really worked well was because of the victims advocates were in the state's attorney's offices. They were employees of the state's attorney's offices, and to hear what we've talked about, what I've heard so far today, just sort of almost paints a different picture from what I see has happened, especially last year. So if I could just clarify that, we never sought out the funding for the Victims Advocates Program. We never sought out anything other. We managed, they were employees of the state. They were employees of each one of our offices. We worked really closely with them to get into a collective bargaining to where that they had a voice. Prior to the entering into the collective bargaining agreement, they were employees at will. And if you had a new state's attorney came in, you could just fire him at any time for no reason. We thought that was pretty bad. And so they went through collective bargaining. I think they're represented extremely well now. And so there are extra added protections. What had happened, and again, this is starting last year, is that we were understood that the federal grants that funded the victims advocates in each of our offices, because we did not have general funds for that. It was all filtered through the grants that Crime Victim Services received. We could not apply for grants ourselves because there had to be a pass-through agency. That pass-through agency was Crime Victim Services. And they told us how much money that they were able to get in the various grants. And then we were, that in turn would let us know how many victims advocates we could have in our offices. Right now, we could probably do twice as many because these people are handling upwards of 1,000 cases. I mean, just think of that, 1,000 cases. How does a victim get real good services, and how do they get that one-on-one when they're handling 1,000 cases? It's ridiculous. But the fact is that that's where the money that we have, because the money supposedly the center either it dried up or that they've put into different programs. But they felt, and this is something that the prior executive director, Chris Fenno, had been pushing for a long time, and that is to eliminate or stay away from the federal funding and get state funding. As we all know, prior to the pandemic, things were not real rosy with with the money here, the state budgets. And once the pandemic funds go away, I think we're going to be right back to where we were. So, but I understand that, last year that when the center said that, they were not able to fund, they want to seek funding through the state, and which they did. And but if the funding was going to go through the state, if it was going to be state funding, it should funnel through the state department where they employs them and manage them. That's what our position was and still remains, is that if it's the funds, if they're state funds, they should go through that state agency or department that actually manages them, that funds them, or that directs them. So other than that, there wasn't really any major issue. And then, of course, and when this S15, or I'm sorry, H35 had come up, clearly the wording, did not, it was, in fact, it actually probably should have been updated a long time ago because it doesn't really speak to some of the current practices, and which is why we changed some of those terminology there. So anyway, once the funding came over, we actually even hired a victim coordinator because there was concern. Let's say we want to make sure that the victims advocates get all the assistance that they need in order to carry out their jobs. So we have a victims advocate coordinator also who manages our different offices and manages I shouldn't say manage, it works with and coordinates our victims advocates. So in this situation, as I think it's been Janet testified, is that there are many other victims advocates programs. Like DOC has their victims advocate, AG has one. There's some, I think DPS has one, and this is just one that was one of really the first one where the state's attorneys were the ones that actually had the victims advocates, because that's the first contact. Once you have the arraignment, you have the person come in, that's the initial contact. And so that's where we wanted to be able to help the most, and which is where we do what we do and still do, as I said, now. And the statute, again, as Janet said, we thought it shouldn't be the Victims Assistance Program. It should be the Victims Advocacy Program. And it's really, the only one it speaks to is our program, the state's attorney's ones. It doesn't discuss the other ones. My concern is, and the fact that everybody realizes that this bill and the statute, again, is directed, deals with solely our department, our employees. So in going through, we did make some changes, recommendations to the language such as the services. And these were based on, first of all, what they do is the new language mirrors the language, the job description for the victims advocates, as was recommended and told to us by Crime Victim Services. So Kara Cookson and Chris Fenno had given us the language saying this is what your job description should be. So this actually just mirrors the job description for victims advocates. And so and as you pointed out, Representative, such as the transportation, because we had actual victims advocates who were driving some of the victims around, and that creates a huge liability issue for a lot of people. And there are times when, because of the number of cases that there has to be sort of a separation. It's not where, that somebody doesn't get so enabled by the services that they're reaching that they don't move on. They don't try to get help, additional help. And the other thing is that as far as the services regarding, counseling services, we were specifically told by HR, unless your person is an actual licensed counselor, you cannot be offering, counseling services, which makes sense. So those are the technical aspects of that. So in essence, I was ready to come in and say, yeah, this is a great bill. And I did not know about the sunset until I walked up to the door here. So I'm not unable to really testify about that, other than to say that it was a policy decision by the legislature last year to have the funding go through our offices for our employees. If you all decide that you want to change that, you can obviously do that. But all I can say is, and ask you, is to make sure that whatever you do, you're doing it with the victims in mind. And you realize that there's a lot of unintended consequences when you take actions and you think it looks good and it may be good here, but on the tail end, you might be doing more harm than good.
This is a general question, probably both to John and to Jen, because it's come up in conversation around the counseling component. I do understand, the licensing is, like there. The question becomes, as we continue the discussion, does it make sense to maybe look at, expanding that service to include, because if you did, then you'd be able to do direct funding through Medicare or Medicaid. Because that would be an additional funding source, because if they're licensed to do that, to provide that service, possibly, you wouldn't necessarily have to have one in every office. You could feasibly have it regionalized so that you might have 3 or 4 covering, that region as a backup to the service, direct service providers. Just food for thought. After getting my window shut out, I guess, I have a little bit of sensitivity.
Yeah. And also, I think it's important to know that as Jenna pointed out, they do the victims' compensation and victim restitution has nothing to do with our office. We don't. All we do are direct intervention, more so not intervention, but contact with the victims to help them through the process to understand what's going on in their cases. So, we don't have to deal. We don't deal with the victims' compensation or restitutions. Totally, that's in their shop.
Karen, then Barbara, and then Ella, and then Joe.
Great. Thank you for coming in today. And I can appreciate how it can feel like, this bill where it's being targeted of like, okay, we're going to put a sunset. We got to look at it. I see it more as this situation came up and it kind of put a spotlight on, oh, shoot, we probably should be looking at this in a bigger lens. So from my perspective, I don't want to see it as like we're looking specifically at the state's attorney's victim advocate program. I'm seeing it more as this kind of cracked open, oh, we need to be looking at victim services in Vermont. This is the path that we can take a look at it right now. So because I think it's important work that they're doing. But because we have this spotlight on, I'm like, okay, let's maybe take this time to look at it. I think there's really a benefit of having this centralized organization that's looking at victim services at the statewide level. And I feel like that's the piece I want to pause and look at, because as we're chipping away these things, to step back and be like, does this make sense? What is our goal as a state that we want to have for victim services? I think, like you said, unintended consequences. We want to look at that. And so I think that's the pause that I want to take. And I feel like a sunset or something would allow us just to take that pause. But I'm hearing you say that a sunset might not be it wouldn't work for you.
I don't see the necessity of it, because you can do, the legislature can go back and change whatever they want to change at any time. I think a sunset's almost a slap in the face of some of our victims advocates. I really do, because I think it's saying that they're not sure. And I heard about like any complaints and things of that nature. I'm not sure if that is a positive message to send to them.
And I guess there's this piece for me of like, it's all how it's translated too, right? Like I see it as this is creating opportunity to look at the bigger picture. I wouldn't want to portray it to them as this is a slap in the face. So I appreciate the perspective.
So 2 things that I want to say off the bat. I decided to do this amendment late yesterday afternoon and did not, it seemed, I just felt uneasy coming in today without putting that amendment in. So my apologies for the lateness of it. I in no way, I agree with you about the victim advocates. I in no way was trying to insinuate or imply that there are complaints about the victim advocates. What the complaints I had heard from some victim advocates was how some state attorney offices were utilizing them. And that goes back a few years. It's not up-to-date information, but at the time, it sounded like there was incredible disparities between how some places were being used. Some were being used more as secretarial roles. It's probably before you were even, I don't know if it's before you were in the position, but that concerned me. And I have been in the situation of having federal grants where employees are placed in state offices and being responsible to make sure that we're being true to the funding source and reporting back like what people are doing. So that's been kind of something that I've been concerned about, as I've been concerned about Center for Crime Victim Services funding model. This report, which I just sent to the committee from last biennium that looked at Vermont criminal justice revenues, had all these different strategies. And one of the strategies was moving the funding and the expense over to the state attorneys. We as a committee never, and I know it wasn't this committee, but House Judiciary never had a discussion about that really. And if we did, it was very casual. We didn't make recommendations, but I expressed concern at the time about that. And again, I didn't know necessarily that general fund money would be allocated, but being responsible to the feds and making sure that whoever's signing off on that report can say, yes, we know that, here's what victims have done. Like, it just didn't seem like a good situation. Again, I know you said this body approved it, but we approved it in the big budget bill that we passed, but we did not, in this committee, and I'm the rep to House Approps, have a discussion about that here. I know a lot of it happened on the Senate side and the ship had sailed at that point. I had discussions with some of with the chair of appropriations and our liaison, Trevor, once I had heard that was in there. But again, it didn't feel like a good policy discussion that led to it. And maybe on the Senate side that did happen, but in my mind, the House didn't do that. And that concerned me. And it's not, so in no way, again, what Representative Jones said, this has nothing to do with, you have an eclectic collection of state attorneys who all run their own show and do things differently. And you have no authority over that. You can suggest things, but it does seem like it's challenging. And I give you credit for doing what you're doing. But I think that, again, if we're thinking about the victim in mind, we just need to make sure where is there overlap with DOC? Like, I don't even feel like we've had all the players in the room yet, or say, where are the holes? Because, again, it's not a reflection on the current advocates, but the way the system feels now to people who have been, and again, I'm just talking about people who've been sexually assaulted, because that's mostly some of the constituents I've talked to. They're like, I was sexually assaulted a second time, and I am not going to bring this forward because it was such a bad experience. But that's on us as a system, not on the victim advocates. And I just kind of want to, and I was mentioning it on a bill the other day. So in the context of that, I feel like we need to continue to look at how do we not, and it's inherent in some ways, but how do we not make that system as hard on victims as we do? And maybe it's having a caseload of 20 for victim advocates. I don't know what the answer is, but I'd love to see that happen. And
I can tell you one of the things for the victims, that one of the feedback that we're getting is like, because now a lot of the actions that are being taken in the legislature are in essence taking laws, or looking more towards the defendants and in their cases versus them. They feel like that people aren't looking out for them. And I'm just repeating what I hear on a regular daily basis, when they feel like they feel like they're not the victims now, or the people that perpetrate the crimes. So
absolutely. No, I think thank you for raising that. I used to work with victims who are like, if I went to prison, I could get my high school education, but as a victim, I don't have this. Like, so I get the unintended messages we're sending, and we do want to make sure that is not happening.
So we're going to need to have more discussion on whether to do something like a report, whether to do sunset, or whether to do neither and just continue our work on this and schedule some testimony from different people and continue that part of the discussion. But if there are any particular questions about the bill language we have right now, and I'm only saying this because we have other witnesses waiting on the next bill. So Ella and Joe, if you could keep the questions tight to the language in the bill right now, and we'll talk about those other issues later.
This is sort of in between, but if you could just briefly comment on, so confirm for me that my understanding is these what are currently being called victim advocates have been in the state's attorney's offices. That's where they've been housed.
Yeah.
For many years.
From the beginning.
Yeah. Could you just briefly comment on how oversight of their work and training, particularly how that's changed over the last time period since this went into action?
In fact, Representative Richardson had raised a good point, because there was a time when you had state's attorneys that did not, in my mind, did not treat the victims advocates or their positions properly. And this is not trying to pat myself on the back, because if it wasn't for the team that I had, like with Andy Noonan, and we changed the conversation in the office when we got there. And I think it helped with, having the victims advocates understand that they had a voice and that they were going to be protected. They were not going to have to worry about their job every time the state's attorney had new state's attorney came in. So I think things have changed there. And I apologize, because you know what, I'm sitting there, I go down rabbit holes. I have a tendency to do that. And I just keep on thinking of these people who are just working their tails off every day. And they're not getting what they need. They're not getting the monies that the resources that they need, their help. I mean, to think of dealing with the number of cases and trying to help them out, it's heartbreaking. It really is. So anyway.
So am I hearing that oversight and training?
Oh, I'm sorry, training. Yeah, the training. Yes, we have changed. I mean, they do annual trainings, and they also go through other trainings. They get. I believe that we have stipends available if they want to go to other trainings. So we encourage that. I mean, you have to. Yeah, I mean, it's still what they're going to stay up. And the other thing too is that and to me, and the reason, and the person we hired as the victims coordinator also is a counselor, a special, because I always felt that victims advocates, like something to law enforcement, they see the worst of the worst, and they need a lot of help themselves, sometimes. So we strongly advocate that. And I think, and maybe the best way to do it would be to have some of the victims advocates come in and testify. And this way they don't feel it's not coming through me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so two questions. First one was earlier in your testimony, you had mentioned that the job description was written by a particular person or people, and I didn't capture that.
Oh, I'm sorry. The job description, we had to come up with a job description, obviously, is through HR when we go ahead and advertise for openings or whatever. And Chris Fenno, who was the prior executive director, and then Kara Cookson, who was the victims advocate coordinator for crime victim services. They had conversations with Annie Noonan, who's she was former Commissioner of Labor, who now is like my number two, my right arm. And so that was how the job description was developed.
Great. And my second question was just involving the bill language, a similar question to earlier. How do you see sort of providing information guidance then differently than providing assistance? And, and you said that's current practice. And do you think that is good, a current practice of simply providing information assistance for information guidance versus assistance? Yeah,
it's like not getting too far over your skis. So, the fact is, the one thing we don't want is we don't want a victims advocate who, give, let's say, financial advice when that person may not have that kind of a background. We don't want the counseling. That's probably the easiest one, is to say you don't want somebody who is going to, and actually it's really, they need the victim to understand as well that there are certain limitations to what their victims advocate can do. Because we do get calls a lot, and they're saying, they didn't do this or they didn't do that. And most of them are like, well, yeah, that's like so far, like, almost giving you medical advice or, whatever. It would just be so far outside of what they really should be doing. And that puts, it takes a toll on our folks too, the victims advocates, who feel like, oh God, I wasn't there for them. But they were. I mean, they're doing what they're supposed to do. And this way at least gives them some confidence in knowing that I'm doing my job as it's set forth.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so very much, and we have some discussions to have on our side, but it sounds like the basic language here is fine with everybody. It sounds just about what we're going to do as far as whether report or sunset, so we'll ponder that a little bit.
I would strongly urge Mr. Chair and committee members to bring in a few of the victims advocates and also Annie from our office, because Annie was the one who was directly involved and probably could answer more Representative Rachelson's questions regarding how this all transpired.
Yeah, one way or another, we're going to dig deeper. So
great. Well, thank you.
All right, we'll adjourn for 10 minutes because we have some other folks, and we will break at 11:45 today. Some other